The flight attendant's voice crackled through the cabin speakers as Flight 447 descended toward San Diego International Airport. Most passengers were checking their phones or gathering belongings, but Navy SEAL Commander Jake Reeves couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the woman in 7B. She'd been reading a dog-eared paperback romance novel for the entire 4-hour flight, occasionally sipping her ginger ale, looking every bit the unremarkable tourist heading to Southern California for vacation. But SEALs don't survive 13 deployment by ignoring their instincts. It started with her posture, too straight, too alert despite the casual sundress and sandals. Her eyes moved in calculated sweeps, cataloging exits and passengers with the practiced efficiency of someone trained to survive. When turbulence hit over Nevada, she'd gripped her armrest with the controlled breathing of someone who'd experienced far worse than commercial airline bumps. Then there was the tattoo. A delicate constellation of stars wrapped around her left wrist, barely visible beneath a loose bracelet that seemed deliberately positioned to conceal it. To most people, it would look like decorative ink, maybe something picked up during a rebellious college phase. But Reeves recognized the pattern: 7 stars arranged in a specific formation that shouldn't exist on civilian skin. The Ursa Major configuration wasn't just any tattoo. It was the classified marking of the 77th Fighter Squadron, the Gamblers, an elite unit that officially didn't exist in any Pentagon documentation accessible to someone below a TS/SCI clearance level. The same unit that had vanished from public records after a series of operations in the South China Sea 3 years ago. As the Boeing 737 touched down with a gentle thud, Reeves watched the woman in 7B. She moved with economic precision, retrieving a single carry-on bag from the overhead compartment without the fumbling urgency of typical passengers. Her movements flowed like water, each gesture minimal and purposeful. When she stood, a shaft of afternoon sunlight streaming through the cabin window illuminated her face for the first time during the flight. Beneath the tourist disguise, the faded San Diego Zoo t-shirt, the oversized sunglasses, the carefully tousled brown hair, was the face of someone who'd stared down death and walked away laughing. Commander Reeves had seen that look before, in mirrors and on the faces of operators who'd earned their survival through skill, luck, and the willingness to do what others couldn't. But he'd never seen it on someone who looked like she'd rather be shopping for seashells than discussing extraction protocols. As passengers filed toward the exit, she moved past his aisle seat. For just a moment, their eyes met. In that brief exchange, he caught something that made his blood run cold: recognition. She knew exactly who he was, just as he was beginning to piece together who she might be. The Boeing's engines wound down as the last passengers disembarked into the California afternoon. Reeves remained seated, mind racing through classified briefings and operational reports, trying to place where he'd seen those steady gray eyes before. Somewhere in the labyrinth of black operations and need-to-know classifications, there was a file with her photograph. He just hoped he'd live long enough to remember why that terrified him. Walking through the terminal 20 minutes later, Dr. Elena Vasquez adjusted her tourist disguise and smiled at how easily people saw exactly what they expected to see. The SEAL in 14C had been watching her. She'd felt his attention like a weight between her shoulder blades from takeoff to landing. Military men were predictably curious about things that didn't fit their narrow definitions of normal. What Commander Reeves couldn't possibly know was that 3 years ago, when the 77th Fighter Squadron officially ceased to exist, Call Sign Phoenix had been flying an F-22 Raptor through Chinese airspace at Mach 2.1, completing a mission that prevented World War III. The constellation tattoo wasn't just a unit identifier. It was a promise etched in skin and sealed with blood. But that was before the betrayal, before the cover-up, before Elena Vasquez, former captain and the youngest pilot ever to earn the Gambler's wings, disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of witness protection and forced retirement. Now she was just another tourist with a PhD in aerospace engineering, living quietly in a rented apartment, teaching community college physics to kids who'd rather be anywhere else. The woman who'd once dogfighted with Chinese J-20s over the Taiwan Strait now spent her days explaining Newton's laws to teenagers who couldn't care less about gravitational constants. Except tonight was different. Tonight, she was about to discover that some promises transcend official death certificates, and that the sky remembers every pilot who's ever claimed it as home. The text message arrived as she unlocked her rental car in the airport parking structure. Unknown number, message encrypted with a cipher she recognized from her previous life. Phoenix, the nest needs you. Hangar 7, Miramar, 200 hours. The general sends his regards. Viper. Alina stared at the screen until the words blurred. General Morrison was supposed to be dead, killed in the same helicopter crash that had officially ended the gambler's existence. Viper, Major Tom Richardson, was supposed to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. Yet here she was, holding proof that her past wasn't as buried as the Pentagon had promised. The phone trembled in her hands as 3 years of careful anonymity crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. She'd spent 36 months perfecting the art of being invisible, of being ordinary, of being Alina the physics teacher instead of Phoenix the pilot. But as she started the rental car's engine and pulled out of the parking structure, muscle memory took over. Her hands found the steering wheel with the same confident grip that had once controlled a $50 million fighter jet. The California sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and rose gold, the same colors that had filled her cockpit window during her final mission over the South China Sea. Back then, she'd been invincible, untouchable, the best pilot in the best squadron in the United States Air Force. Tomorrow, she might discover whether Phoenix could rise from administrative ashes, or if Alina Vasquez would disappear forever into whatever storm was brewing at Miramar. Hangar 7 at Marine Corps Air Station, Miramar stood like a dark monument against the star-filled sky when Alina arrived at 1:58 hours. The facility was officially decommissioned, another casualty of base realignment and closure procedures that had swept through military installations like a bureaucratic plague. But the electronic keypad beside the service entrance hummed with power, and her old access code, a combination of her birthday and service number that should have been purged from every system in the Department of Defense, still worked. Inside, emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across empty space that had once housed a squadron of F-22 Raptors. The air smelled of old hydraulic fluid and the metallic tang of aviation fuel that never quite faded from concrete floors, no matter how many years passed. "You're late, Phoenix." The voice emerged from the darkness near the far wall, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. General Marcus Morrison stepped into the light, looking exactly the same as he had 3 years ago, silver-haired, granite-jawed, with the bearing of a man who'd spent 4 decades making impossible decisions for his country. Alina's heart hammered against her ribs. "You're supposed to be dead, sir." "Death is a flexible concept in our line of work." Morrison's smile held no warmth. The helicopter crash was, creatively staged, necessary for what came after. What came after was the gamblers being dissolved and scattered to the winds. What came after was me teaching algebra to teenagers while pretending my service record never existed. Alina's voice carried 3 years of buried anger. What came after was you abandoning every pilot who trusted you. The general's expression didn't change. What came after was preventing a war that would have killed 50 million people in the first week. The gamblers did their job, Phoenix, better than anyone had a right to expect. From the shadows behind a maintenance scaffold, a second figure emerged. Major Tom Richardson, call sign Viper, looked older, harder, with new scars across his left cheek and hands that trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking. But his eyes still held the predatory focus that had made him the squadron's best wingman. "Elena," Viper's voice was rough, like sandpaper across raw wood. "Good to see you made it out in one piece." She studied both men, nodding the careful way they positioned themselves, the subtle tenseness that suggested they weren't entirely sure of her response. "Made it out of what, exactly? Because last I checked, I was the only one who didn't get the memo about resurrection." Morrison exchanged a glance with Richardson before answering. "The mission in the South China Sea accomplished its primary objective. We prevented Chinese forces from establishing air superiority over Taiwan. But it also revealed something we hadn't anticipated. A technology that changes everything we thought we knew about aerial combat." Elena felt the familiar chill that preceded classified briefings, the moment when reality shifted and previously impossible scenarios became operational necessities. "What kind of technology?" Instead of answering, Viper walked to a wall-mounted control panel and entered a sequence Elena recognized as an old squadron authentication code. Overhead lights blazed to life, illuminating the hangar's contents. In the center of the space, gleaming under the harsh fluorescence like a predator made of carbon fiber and titanium, sat an aircraft that shouldn't exist. The jet was sleek beyond anything Elena had ever seen, its surface reflecting light in ways that seemed to bend the laws of physics. No visible engine intakes, no traditional control surfaces, no external weapons pylons. It looked less like a fighter aircraft and more like something that had fallen from orbit, alien and impossibly advanced. Elena circled the craft slowly, her engineer's mind cataloging details that didn't make sense. The skin appeared to be some kind of metamaterial that shifted color subtly as she moved, adapting to ambient light in real time. The cockpit canopy was so seamlessly integrated with the fuselage that she couldn't see where one ended and the other began. "Jesus Christ," the words escaped before she could stop them. "What is this thing?" "Prototype designation Aurora 7, Morrison replied. "Recovered from a crashed Chinese aircraft approximately 48 hours ago. Our intelligence suggests Beijing has been developing this technology for the past 5 years, using data stolen from classified American research programs." Viper moved to stand beside the aircraft's nose cone, his scarred face grim. "The pilot didn't survive the crash, but the flight recorder did. Elena, they've solved controlled plasma propulsion. This thing doesn't need traditional engines. It manipulates electromagnetic fields to achieve thrust ratios we thought were impossible." Elena's breath caught. Plasma propulsion had been theoretical for decades, the holy grail of aerospace engineering that promised speeds and maneuverability that would make current fighter jets look like crop dusters. If the Chinese had actually weaponized the technology. "How fast?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. Morrison's smile was cold as winter. "Mach 7 in atmosphere, Mach 12 in near-space environments, and it can change direction at forces that would liquefy a human pilot, except the cockpit uses some kind of inertial dampening system we don't understand yet." The implications hit Elena like a physical blow. Air superiority, the foundation of American military doctrine for 70 years, would be meaningless against aircraft that could outrun missiles and pull maneuvers that defied physics. Every fighter pilot in the world would be flying obsolete machines against opponents who might as well be wielding magic. "So what do you need from me?" Elena asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. General Morrison's expression grew serious. "We need Phoenix to fly it." The words hung in the air like unexploded ordnance. Elena stared at the impossible aircraft, her mind racing through the tactical and strategic implications of what Morrison was suggesting. Flying an experimental enemy aircraft based on technology they didn't understand was the kind of mission that ended careers, or lives, in spectacular fashion. You want me to test fly a Chinese prototype that probably has more classified technology packed into it than exists in our entire fighter fleet. Alina's voice was carefully neutral, the tone she'd learned to use when superior officers proposed missions that bordered on suicidal. Using propulsion systems we don't understand, control interfaces we haven't seen before, and inertial dampening technology that might turn me into paste if it malfunctions. Viper nodded grimly. That's about the size of it, yeah. Alina walked around the Aurora 7 again, this time focusing on technical details. The landing gear was retracted, but she could see the mechanisms. Elegant, minimal, clearly designed for aircraft that didn't need traditional runways. The entire craft seemed designed around principles that made conventional aviation engineering look primitive. "What happened to the other gamblers?" she asked without looking at Morrison. "The ones who supposedly died with you in that helicopter crash." "Reassigned to black projects mostly. Some retired with full benefits and new identities. A few," Morrison paused, choosing his words carefully, "a few didn't make it through the transition." The euphemism hit Alina like a slap. In the shadow world of classified operations, "didn't make it through the transition" usually meant someone had asked too many questions or posed too much of a security risk. The kind of problems that got solved with car accidents and heart attacks that looked completely natural to anyone who wasn't trained to recognize the signs. "And if I refuse?" Alina asked. "Then you go back to teaching physics and pretend this conversation never happened," Morrison replied. "But Dr. Alina Vasquez, we both know that's not who you really are. You're Phoenix, the pilot who flew through a wall of surface-to-air missiles to complete the Taiwan mission. You're the woman who holds the unofficial speed record for an F-22 in vertical climb. You're the only person in this hangar who has the combination of technical knowledge and pure flying ability to make this work." Alina closed her eyes, feeling the familiar tug of adrenaline and purpose that had driven her through 13 combat deployments. For 3 years, she tried to bury that part of herself, to find satisfaction in the quiet life of a civilian academic. But standing next to the Aurora 7, surrounded by the ghosts of her former life, she could feel Phoenix stirring in her chest like a flame that had never quite gone out. "What's the timeline?" she asked, knowing that her question was as good as acceptance. Morrison's smile was sharp as a blade. 72 hours. Chinese intelligence knows we recovered the aircraft, and they'll be coming to get it back. We need to understand what we're dealing with before that happens." Alina opened her eyes and looked at the sleek predator that would either make her legend or kill her in ways that hadn't been invented yet. Either way, it beat teaching Newton's laws to teenagers who would rather be playing video games. "All right, General," she said quietly, "Phoenix is back." The briefing room adjacent to Hangar 7 had been hastily assembled from folding tables and military surplus electronics, but the classified materials spread across its surfaces represented the cutting edge of aerospace intelligence. Alina studied technical diagrams that looked more like abstract art than engineering schematics, her mind struggling to process systems that operated on principles she'd never encountered. Dr. James Chen, the Pentagon's chief aerospace analyst, looked like he hadn't slept in a week. His usually immaculate lab coat was wrinkled, and his hands shook slightly as he manipulated holographic displays showing the Aurora 7's internal structure. "The propulsion system is unlike anything in our theoretical models," Chen explained, highlighting a series of chambers that ran through the aircraft's core. "Instead of combustion or jet engines, it appears to use controlled plasma fields to create thrust. The pilot can essentially manipulate gravity and electromagnetic forces to achieve impossible maneuvers." Alina leaned forward, studying the three-dimensional cutaway view. "What about G-forces? Even with the best pressure suits, human pilots black out at 9 or 10 Gs sustained." "That's where it gets interesting." Chen manipulated the display to show the cockpit interior. The Chinese have developed some kind of localized field generator that creates a bubble of modified space-time around the pilot's seat. We think it redistributes inertial forces, but we're honestly guessing at the physics. Viper looked up from his own stack of intelligence reports. The flight data recorder shows the Chinese pilot pulling 47 Gs during evasive maneuvers. That should have turned him into organic soup, but the biometric data indicates he remained conscious and functional throughout. Alina felt a chill run down her spine. 47 Gs was beyond the realm of human survival, even for pilots in peak physical condition. If the Aurora 7 could protect its occupant from those forces while maintaining combat effectiveness, it represented a revolution in aerial warfare that would make every existing fighter aircraft obsolete overnight. "What about weapon systems?" she asked. Morrison activated another holographic display showing the aircraft's external configuration. No visible hardpoints for conventional missiles or guns, but there are these. He highlighted a series of almost invisible ports along the aircraft's leading edges. "We think they're some kind of directed energy weapons, possibly laser or particle beam systems." Alina studied the placement of the weapon ports, noting how they were integrated into the aircraft's stealth profile. No external pylons meant no radar signature from mounted weapons, while directed energy systems would be limited only by the craft's power generation capability rather than ammunition stores. "Power plant?" she asked. Chen's expression grew troubled. "That's the biggest mystery. We can't find anything that looks like a conventional reactor or engine. The entire aircraft seems to be powered by some kind of zero-point energy extraction system that we don't understand at all." The room fell silent as the implication sank in. Zero-point energy, the theoretical quantum vacuum that some scientists believed could provide unlimited power, had been the holy grail of physics research for decades. If the Chinese had somehow weaponized it, they weren't just ahead in aerospace technology. They'd achieved a breakthrough that would revolutionize human civilization. Alina pushed back from the table and walked to the observation window that looked out into the hangar. The Aurora 7 sat under the harsh lights like a sleeping predator, its surface seeming to pulse with barely contained energy. Everything about it violated the laws of physics as she understood them, yet there it was, solid, real, and potentially lethal. "How long do we have before Beijing realizes what we've got?" she asked. Morrison consulted his watch. Intelligence estimates 72 hours before they mount a recovery operation. After that, this facility will become a battlefield, and we'll be fighting an enemy that can fly circles around anything in our inventory. Alina turned back to face the room. "What's our extraction plan if this goes sideways?" The silence that followed her question was answer enough. This wasn't the kind of mission where extraction plans mattered, because there wouldn't be anywhere to extract to if she failed. The Aurora 7 represented either a chance to level the playing field or the first shot in a war that America couldn't win with conventional weapons. "All right," Alina said quietly, "when do we start?" Chen activated a final display showing the aircraft's cockpit interface. A bewildering array of holographic controls and neural interface ports that looked more like something from a science fiction movie than actual flight hardware. "First flight is scheduled for 600 hours, Morrison replied. "Dr. Chen will walk you through the control systems, and we've prepared a series of graduated test flights to evaluate the aircraft's capabilities and your adaptation to the technology." Alina nodded, feeling the familiar pre-mission combination of excitement and terror that every combat pilot knew. But this was different. She wasn't just testing a new aircraft. She was potentially opening a door into a future where the fundamental rules of warfare had changed forever. As the briefing continued into the early morning hours, one thought kept returning to her mind. Phoenix had always been the call sign of a pilot who rose from destruction stronger than before. Tomorrow, She'd discover whether that legend could survive contact with technology that made legends irrelevant. At 5:45 hours, Alina stood beside the Aurora 7 in a flight suit that felt alien against her skin. The Chinese-designed pilot interface included neural contact points and biometric sensors that seemed to read her intentions as much as her physical inputs. Dr. Chen had spent the previous 4 hours explaining systems that operated on principles so advanced they might as well have been magic. But Alina knew that when she strapped into that cockpit, theory would give way to instinct and training. The pre-flight checklist was unlike anything she'd ever encountered. Instead of checking fuel levels, engine parameters, and hydraulic systems, she was verifying quantum field generators, plasma containment integrity, and something called temporal displacement buffers that Chen admitted he didn't fully understand. "Remember," Viper said as he helped her with the helmet interface, "this isn't an F-22. Every instinct you've developed about flight dynamics and combat maneuvering might work against you. The Aurora 7 responds to thought as much as physical input." Alina nodded, though she wasn't sure how anyone could prepare for aircraft that read minds. The helmet felt strange, lighter than conventional flight gear, but with additional neural interface points that pressed against her skull like cold metal fingers. When Chen activated the system, the world exploded into information. Suddenly, Alina could sense the Aurora 7 systems as if they were extensions of her own body. She felt the plasma chambers cycling to life, the quantum field generators establishing their invisible grip on space-time, the weapon systems running through automated diagnostics. It was overwhelming and exhilarating, like having superhuman senses grafted onto her consciousness. "Phoenix, how do you copy?" Morrison's voice crackled through the comm system. "Reading you 5x5, control." Alina's voice was steadier than she felt. "Systems are showing green across the board, though I'm not sure I understand half of what I'm looking at." "That's normal for the first flight," Chen assured her. "The aircraft's AI is designed to assist with system management until the pilot adapts to the interface. Just focus on basic flight controls and let the computer handle the advanced functions." Alina took a deep breath and activated the launch sequence. The Aurora 7 didn't roar to life like a conventional fighter jet. Instead, it seemed to hum with barely audible energy, as if reality itself was being quietly rearranged around its sleek form. The aircraft lifted off the hangar floor without any sensation of thrust or acceleration, rising as smoothly as if gravity had simply forgotten to affect it. "Jesus," Viper whispered over the comm, "it's like watching a magic trick." Alina guided the Aurora 7 through the hangar doors and into the pre-dawn darkness above Miramar. The aircraft responded to her thoughts with impossible precision, turning and climbing in ways that her engineer's mind insisted should be impossible. When she pulled into a vertical climb, expecting to feel the familiar weight of G-forces crushing her into the seat, she felt nothing. The inertial dampening field created a bubble of normal physics around her body, while the aircraft pulled maneuvers that would have liquefied a conventional pilot. "Phoenix, your rate of climb is showing 11,000 feet per minute." Morrison's voice carried a mixture of awe and concern. "Are you experiencing any physiological stress?" Alina checked her instruments, noting that the Aurora 7 was climbing at a rate that should have been impossible for any aircraft, let alone one that appeared to weigh less than a conventional fighter jet. But she felt completely normal, as if she were sitting in a chair rather than piloting the most advanced aircraft ever built. "Negative on the stress, control. This thing flies like it's thinking for itself." And that, Alina realized, might be exactly what was happening. The neural interface wasn't just reading her intentions, it was learning from them, adapting to her flying style and anticipating her decisions. She could feel the aircraft's artificial intelligence working alongside her own instincts, creating a fusion of human intuition and machine precision that was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. As the Aurora 7 reached 30,000 feet in less than 3 minutes, Alina began to understand why the Chinese had been so confident about their technological superiority. This wasn't just a better fighter jet. It was a complete paradigm shift that made every conventional aircraft in existence as obsolete as biplanes in the jet age. But paradigm shifts, Alina knew from her combat experience, could cut both ways. And as the California dawn painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, she began to formulate ideas about how American pilots might adapt to fight an enemy that had already moved beyond the traditional rules of aerial warfare. The test flights continued for 3 days, each sortie revealing new capabilities that defied conventional understanding of aerospace engineering. Alina learned to think in 3 dimensions that included temporal displacement, to dogfight at speeds that made sound itself seem sluggish, and to execute maneuvers that her F-22 experience had taught her were physically impossible. On the final test flight, as she pushed the Aurora 7 through a series of combat scenarios against simulated enemy targets, something fundamental clicked into place. The boundary between pilot and aircraft dissolved, replaced by a seamless integration of human creativity and machine capability that felt more like evolution than simple technological advancement. "Phoenix, bring her home," Morrison's voice crackled through the comm. "We've got company incoming." Alina checked her long-range sensors and felt her blood turn to ice. 6 aircraft were approaching from the northwest, flying in formation at speeds that conventional radar would dismiss as instrument error. Their signatures matched the Aurora 7's almost exactly, except these weren't prototypes. They were production models, flown by pilots who'd been training with the technology for years rather than days. "Control, I'm showing 6 bogies inbound, bearing 270 at Angels 40. They're flying Aurora-class aircraft." "Confirmed, Phoenix. Chinese recovery force, right on schedule. Your orders are to return to base immediately and avoid engagement." Alina looked at her tactical display, noting the positioning and approach vectors of the incoming aircraft. They were flying in a classic search and destroy formation, clearly intending to recover their lost prototype and eliminate any evidence of American reverse engineering efforts. Hangar 7, with its hastily assembled research team and irreplaceable technical data, would be their primary target. The smart play was to run, to return to base, land the Aurora 7, and hope that Morrison's promised reinforcements arrived before the Chinese aircraft turned Miramar into a crater. But Alina had spent enough combat missions watching good people die, because someone in command had made the smart decision instead of the necessary one. "Control, I'm seeing an intercept opportunity. If I can engage them before they reach the base." "Negative, Phoenix. You are explicitly ordered to return to base immediately. That is a direct order." Alina stared at the tactical display, watching the Chinese formation close the distance to Miramar at impossible speeds. In 12 minutes, maybe less, they'd be in weapons range of the hangar. Morrison, Viper, Chen, and a dozen other personnel would have perhaps 60 seconds to evacuate before directed energy weapons turned the facility into superheated plasma. Or she could do what Phoenix had always done, rise from the ashes of impossible situations, and find a way to protect the people who mattered. "Control, Phoenix copies your order," Alina said quietly, "but I'm afraid I can't comply." She banked the Aurora 7 toward the incoming formation and pushed the throttle to maximum power, feeling the aircraft respond with acceleration that pressed her back into the seat despite the inertial dampening field. For the first time in 3 years, Captain Alina Vasquez was about to discover whether legends could survive contact with their own future. The engagement began at a range that made conventional air combat look like a knife fight in a closet. Alina's heads-up display tracked the Chinese formation as they spread out into attack positions, their aircraft moving with coordinated precision that spoke of pilots who'd been training together for years. She was outnumbered 6-1, flying an aircraft she'd learned to operate 3 days ago, against enemies who helped design the technology she was trying to master. But Alina had advantages they couldn't anticipate. While the Chinese pilots had been training with production Aurora aircraft, she'd been learning to fly their prototype, the testbed model that contained experimental systems and capabilities their operational fighters might not possess. More importantly, she was flying with the desperate creativity of someone who had nothing left to lose. Phoenix to control, initiating engagement. Break radio silence only for tactical updates. Alina dove toward the ocean, using the Aurora 7's impossible maneuverability to position herself beneath the Chinese formation. At 30,000 feet, she pulled into a vertical climb that would have stalled any conventional aircraft. But the Aurora 7 responded like gravity was merely a suggestion rather than a universal law. The first Chinese pilot never saw her coming. Alina's targeting system locked onto his aircraft and fired a burst from the directed energy weapons, watching as coherent light turned titanium and carbon fiber into expanding plasma. The enemy aircraft simply ceased to exist, vaporized so completely that there was no debris to track on radar. "Splash one," Alina whispered, already rolling away from the return fire that lit up the sky where she'd been moments before. The remaining 5 Chinese aircraft reacted with professional competence, spreading out into a spherical formation that would have been impossible to achieve with conventional fighters. Alina found herself surrounded by enemies who could match her speed and maneuverability, flown by pilots who knew their aircraft's capabilities far better than she knew hers. But Alina had learned something during her years with the Gamblers. Sometimes the only way to survive an impossible situation was to make it even more impossible for everyone else. She activated systems that Dr. Chen had warned her were still experimental, pushing the Aurora 7 beyond its tested parameters and into the realm of calculated risks that could either save her life or end it spectacularly. The temporal displacement buffer engaged with a sensation like stepping through cold honey. Suddenly, Alina perceived the battle at a different rate, not slowed time, but shifted time, where her reactions occurred in the spaces between her enemy's thoughts. She watched directed energy beams track toward where she had been rather than where she was going, giving her precious milliseconds to position herself for return shots. Alina's second kill came as she materialized inside the Chinese formation's defensive sphere, her weapons firing at point-blank range into an aircraft that had been maneuvering to block an attack from her previous position. The pilot's last transmission was a burst of Mandarin that her translation software identified as approximately equivalent to, "How is that possible?" 4 aircraft remained, and their pilots were beginning to adapt to her tactics. Alina could hear them coordinating over their tactical frequency, working together with the kind of seamless teamwork that came from years of joint training. They were learning her patterns, anticipating her moves, closing the trap with mechanical precision. But Alina had one more card to play, the same desperate gamble that had made Phoenix legendary during the Taiwan mission. She shut down every non-essential system in the Aurora 7, routing all available power to the weapons and propulsion systems, and dove toward the ocean at a rate that made her earlier maneuvers look cautious. At 500 feet above the Pacific, traveling at Mach 4 and accelerating, Alina pulled the hardest turn of her life. The Aurora 7's inertial dampening field flickered under the strain, and she felt G-forces that should have been impossible slam her into the seat like a giant's fist. But the aircraft held together, carving an impossible arc that brought her up behind the Chinese formation just as they dove to follow her apparent suicide run. "Phoenix to control," she gasped as her weapons found their targets. 3 more splashes, 2 bogies remaining, heading back toward Chinese airspace. Alina watched the surviving aircraft retreat, their pilots presumably deciding that recovering a prototype wasn't worth facing an enemy who seemed to violate the laws of physics at will. As the adrenaline faded, she became aware that the Aurora 7 systems were showing warning lights across multiple displays, and several of the experimental modifications she'd activated were now permanently offline. But Hangar 7 was safe, the research data was secure, and Alina had just demonstrated that American pilots could learn to fight in the age of impossible aircraft. As she guided the damaged Aurora 7 back toward Miramar, she allowed herself a small smile. Phoenix had risen from the ashes once again. The only question now was whether the rest of the world was ready for what came next. The debriefing took 6 hours and involved more intelligence analysts than Alina had seen in one room since her Pentagon days. The footage from her engagement with the Chinese formation was being studied frame by frame, with experts trying to understand how she'd managed to defeat pilots who should have held every possible advantage. General Morrison looked like he'd aged a decade in the 3 days since Alina's first test flight. His usually immaculate uniform was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too much coffee and not enough sleep. Phoenix, that was either the most brilliant piece of flying in military history or the most reckless, he said quietly. I'm still trying to decide which. Alina sat in the uncomfortable metal chair and tried to process what she'd experienced during the engagement. The neural interface with the Aurora 7 had created sensations and capabilities that were difficult to describe in conventional terms, as if she'd temporarily become something more than human while remaining fundamentally herself. The temporal displacement system, she said finally. It's not just about maneuvering advantage. It changes how you perceive the battle space, how you think about cause and effect. When I was fighting those pilots, I wasn't just reacting to their moves. I was operating in the spaces between their decisions. Dr. Chen looked up from his analysis of the Aurora 7's flight data. The quantum field generators recorded power spikes that should have been impossible. You pushed the aircraft well beyond its theoretical limits, but instead of catastrophic failure, the system seemed to adapt and compensate. Alina nodded, remembering the moment when the boundary between pilot and machine had dissolved completely. The AI learned from the combat stress. It started making modifications to its own programming in real time, optimizing for survival rather than following pre-programmed parameters. Viper leaned forward, his scarred face intense. Are you saying the aircraft was evolving during the fight? I think so. By the end of the engagement, it was responding to my intentions before I was fully conscious of them myself. We weren't just working together, we'd become something new. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Artificial intelligence that could evolve under combat stress represented a technological breakthrough with ramifications far beyond military applications. If the Aurora 7 systems could adapt and improve themselves, they were dealing with something closer to a new form of life than a simple machine. Morrison activated a secure holographic display showing global intelligence updates. The Chinese withdrawal isn't permanent. Satellite reconnaissance shows 3 additional Aurora squadrons being moved to forward bases in the South China Sea. They're preparing for a full-scale recovery operation. Alina studied the deployment patterns, noting the strategic positioning that would allow Chinese forces to establish air superiority.